So we usually don't wait for people to jump in. Most of what I have to say at the beginning is filler anyway, and so if people jump in later on and they miss that, it's okay.
Right. And Terry, you're doing the housekeeping for Zoom and everything in the welcome? Okay, great.
Thanks.
Okay. Right. I will get us live now. All right, we are live and we're getting folks coming in.
Great, thank you so much, Lee. Hi again, everyone. My name is Terry Beswick, and I'm the Executive Director of the GLBT Historical Society. I'm really excited about tonight's panel, where we're going to be talking about being transgender in a pandemic. And it's part of the GLBT Historical Society's Fighting Back series. So before we get started, I just want to make a brief introduction about the organization that's hosting tonight's event. Talk a little bit about the series so people understand, what's bringing us all together. And then I'll introduce our panelists and we'll get into the discussion. For those who are listening live on Zoom, feel free to post a question. We prefer that you do that in the Q&A box. If you hover your mouse down below on the Q&A box, you can click there and post a question for one of the panelists or all the panelists if you like. You can also use the chat function down below and use that to post any kind of comments or links to resources that you want to highlight for others to see. And with that, I'm going to get started and just talk a little bit about the Historical Society. We were founded in 1985. We have a small museum in the Castro neighborhood of San Francisco, and we also have a large archives in the mid-market neighborhood of San Francisco, which is really one of the largest collections, if not the largest independent collection of LGBTQ historical materials in the world. So we're very proud of that. Our mission is to collect and preserve and share our diverse queer history in all its varieties. And part of that work is through our exhibitions at the museum, the archival research downtown, and through programs like this one. So, and I just want to say that with the Fighting Back series, we started this in 2017 after the inauguration of Donald Trump. And we really wanted to find a way to connect our history with contemporary issues as part of the resistance movement nationally. And so we'd like to bring together intergenerational panels of community experts, community historians, and activists to explore lessons from the past that might be useful in formulating the resistance movement today. So the Fighting Back series, when we went into the shutdown mode a few months ago, we went from into a weekly online series. And there's so much to explore in looking at the COVID crisis in particular through the lens of the AIDS epidemic, taking lessons from AIDS and applying them to the COVID world that we have today. So we hope that people will be inspired to find ways to transform their possible feelings of anxiety, despair, and anger into action, and to find models for building community and solidarity in the midst of the pandemic. So tonight's forum specifically is about the challenges of and opportunities for transgender people in this current environment. And so I want to just introduce that by talking about the purpose. So during the height of the AIDS epidemic in the United States, transgender people were often underrepresented in HIV prevention campaigns, services, clinical research, and access to care. And to this day, as we confront the COVID-19 pandemic, members of the transgender community are more likely to experience unemployment, homelessness, and inadequate access to healthcare. Sheltering in place may lead to conflicts with transphobic family members or housemates and has curtailed access to relevant healthcare, including transition-related treatments. So tonight our panel will consider how the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 90s affected the transgender community and identify strategies to provide support to transgender people during the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. And with that, I also just want to say that in the last few weeks, these forums have brought in the additional subject of the Black Lives Matter movement and looking at police brutality, systemic racism, and white supremacy, and how the topics that we're confronting here, specifically the transgender communities and the COVID epidemic and the AIDS epidemic, intersect with those challenges of racism. So with that, I just want to introduce our esteemed panel, starting off with Eva Hayward, who received her PhD from the University of California, Santa Cruz in the history of consciousness. Hayward has previously taught courses in film, video, aesthetics, science studies, and feminist queer theory at the UC Santa Cruz, University of New Mexico, Uppsala University in Sweden, Duke University, and the University of Cincinnati. Currently, she's an assistant professor in gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Her research focuses on aesthetics, environmental and science studies, and transgender history. Welcome, Eva, to the panel. Aidan Hellstrom is a QTY Programs Fellow with the Transgender Cultural District in San Francisco. He is a trans-masc, non-binary, queer, polyamorous, pansexual. A homeless youth since the age of 17, he has been living in an SRO since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Aidan. Janetta Johnson has been on panels with the Historical Society before. She's the executive director of the Transgender, Gender Variant, Intersex Justice Project, the PGI Justice Project, a group of transgender, gender variant, and intersex individuals inside and outside of prisons, jails, and detention centers who are working to create a united family in the struggle for survival and freedom. She co-founded the conference Transgender Cultural District, the first transgender cultural district in the country, in San Francisco in 2016. She also co-founded PAJA's coalition, which advocates for community accountability for Black trans safety in San Francisco. And last but not least, my friend Tony Newman is a consultant with the Transgender Strategy Center based in Los Angeles. Tony is a 1985 graduate of Wake Forest University and a current JD candidate. She was formerly the executive director for St. James Infirmary, the development director for Maytree Compassionate Care and HIV/AIDS Hospice in San Francisco, and the interim director of development and communications at the To Help Everyone Health and Wellness Center in Los Angeles. I hope I got all that right. And I just, again, want to welcome you all. So I'm hoping for a full discussion tonight. As I mentioned, for those who are joining us since we started, we encourage people to ask questions. We're probably going to hold those until later in the program. And I just wanted to invite, first of all, our four panelists tonight to just talk a little bit about your work, and in particular, as it relates to HIV and AIDS or COVID and the transgender community, or whatever else you would like to talk about. Who would like to get us started? Tony?
I've been working in the HIV area for about 10 years. I started To Help Everyone Health and Wellness. And I just wanted to say, inequity in the transgender community has always been a problem for transgenders when it comes to poverty, homelessness, violence, and HIV infection. we're always under the poverty level. And in this current state that we're in now, the inequity had just about doubled with transgenders getting, Trump is now reversing healthcare for transgenders during a pandemic. I mean, we're already were in equity in the very beginning before this ever began. And now we're facing healthcare discriminations with Donald Trump and his new laws that were infected just in June. And I just don't understand why in the gay community, in the Black community, we can't get the equity that we deserve as Black trans folks, as well as transgenders. And I think Blacks and people of color, transgenders, are the ones who suffer the most with poverty, homelessness, education, violence, and HIV. And I'm just wanting not only the police to listen, not only the Black community, not only the gay community, but the whole world we seem to be fighting for equality more than anyone else. We seem to be at the bottom of the barrel. And where do we get equity is my question. I would like to see the transgenders, especially people of color, get equity. We get it from all ends. We're getting it from the gay community, LGBTQIAAA, the police department, and we're getting it from our own community, the Black community. So the inequity during this pandemic has been tripled. I'm working with organizations in Mississippi, DC, and Los Angeles. And these organizations who are Black trans-led are suffering financially. And we need to get more equity is the point I would like to make among the trans folks of color. They're suffering, and from all angles, from all perspectives, inequity is popping up in all communities when it comes to trans folks of color.
Great. Yeah, there's a lot there, and I'm sure we will come back to those themes again. Ava, you look like you're ready to speak.
Sure. I recently finished editing a special issue of Transgender Studies Quarterly with Che Gossett, who's a really important emergent scholar, but a longtime activist who's worked on prison abolition work, trans of color, particularly Black trans advocacy. And one of the things we wanted to think about is why so little critical attention, not only within academic fields like AIDS studies or lesbian and gay studies, but why even within trans studies, there was a lack of attention to the role HIV AIDS has had on trans populations, particularly Black trans women. And so we tried to bring together a collection of pieces by artist Keon Williams, Tourmaline, and by thinkers and theorists to try to, and historians, to try to reflect upon that. So for me, it's been important to continue to raise awareness about the ways in which HIV affects trans communities.
Great. And that's probably what we're going to plunge into first after our opening round. Janetta or Aiden?
Hi, this is Janetta. And I think of COVID-19 and I think of the various pandemics that are happening. I think about movement for Black Lives Matter, Black Trans Lives Matter, all Black Lives Matter. And just realizing that right now where we are with the murders that's happening in various capacity on Black bodies. And I think that the Black transgender community is very angry and hurt and scared. And I think that living here in San Francisco in the Bay Area and seeing all the anti-Blackness that happens within this city and county that is being perpetuated against Black trans people. And I think that I'm very clear that there's been a situation where Black trans women were completely locked out of housing structures, that they were part of the process of speaking with the Board of Supervisors, speaking with various people and sharing their stories in detail about the pain and trauma that they've experienced, and to also have an organization to be intentional about and making it clear to lock Black trans people out of housing that they are on the cover of, and their pictures are on those covers, their personal testimonies are on those covers, and they are still not housed. They're still not housed. And that's where the anti-Blackness comes in, because if you're a Black trans woman living in this city, you really have to basically kiss somebody's butt in order to get the sustainability that you need in your work. And I feel that it makes it harder on Black trans-led organization because we are always understaffed, and which puts executive directors and housing directors are on the front lines of providing services, particularly between the pandemic, and supporting Black trans people of color, trans people coming out of jails and prison into shelter in place, specifically knowing that there was a mandate. However, it created a whole different framework of work, but we were committed to making sure that Black trans people coming out of prison, and trans people that are sex workers were sheltered in place throughout this pandemic. And it's been really, really hard labor, and it's very understaffed. And once again, I will reiterate, having Black trans, Gen Z, non-binary EDs on the front line in the street, doing the case management, doing the referral, making sure people get their meals, making sure people get their needs met, because of lack of funding, and also just the fact of, and I will reiterate, having an organization make a mandate that there's all these housing and all these subsidies, and there is not. They are all for people of Latino descent, and Black trans women were completely excluded in that process.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I want to be sure that we bring back and talk about housing, obviously, in the midst of this particular pandemic as being critical for sheltering in place. And I also want to make sure that we talk about people being released from prison and jail, and or current prisoners, and sex workers as well, in this environment. Aidan, what's going on with you at the Transgender Culture District? What are you working on there?
At the district, earlier in the start of the pandemic, we had worked on giving COVID-19 relief funds to people within the people who identify as trans. So my work with the district as an intern was to like send out emails and make sure, just make sure that people are actually getting the funds. We sent out these funds to help support them during the pandemic, since a lot of people have been losing jobs, haven't really had money for food, or like there also have been like less job opportunities for people to get jobs and money to help like support them. So we just wanted to try and help support people with some funds. Though the funds recently have just closed the COVID-19 relief funds though. But yeah, that's what we were doing earlier.
Great, well, thank you for that work. Are you still working with the district now, or?
Yes.
Okay, great. And so what is your ongoing work there?
Right now, I'm working with some people on groups to help, have like support groups for people to have like community and stuff with, one is Pro Talk and the other one is for people who identify as non-binary.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Those are being done on Zoom, I presume?
Yeah.
Something like that? Okay, cool. Well, great, thank you for that work. So there's a lot here. Help me out. What do we start with first? I mean, there's so much, and we've got an hour. So, change course if you like, but I'm you know, I've been an activist for a long time in the AIDS and gay community in particular, and I'm thinking about how the transgender community always seems to be fighting for enough, you know, fighting for a seat at the table and fighting for recognition within that LGBTQ political agenda. You know, obviously we saw the Supreme Court ruling on Monday, and that was fantastic that it covered transgender people, but I'm also recalling how long it took to get the major gay rights organizations to even include transgender people in the ENDA legislation, for example. So that's on a federal level, but when we get down to on the street, you know, in providing services and you know, providing, you know, housing and so on to people, especially in the middle of a pandemic, that's when you really see the disparities start to happen. So I guess my question is, like, how do you see that, the transgender political agenda functioning within the LGBTQ agenda, and how has that played out with respect to the AIDS epidemic and with COVID?
Hi, this is Janetta. I think it's been really challenging, and I will say that for me, I feel like there's a part of it is a snake gate, and I feel like a lot of people are a lot of white, non-Black led organizations are pitting Black trans people against each other and creating these different barriers where Black and brown trans led organizations are afraid to lose. So we are willing to cross each other and stab each other in the back by any means necessary. And I feel like a lot of Black trans led organizations are afraid to be unapologetically Black. And as a result of that, they are willing to do anything just to hold on to the sustainability that we had, because a lot of us are in some places that we never thought we would be. And we're still trying to maintain what we feel is that lifestyle. And nobody is willing to be unapologetically Black. Everybody, a lot of trans people feel like if we don't have the white community leading us, that we will lose. And because of the harm that we do to each other and the trauma that we cause to each other gets in the way of us moving forward in the way that we need to move forward. And I'm a firm believer it's pitted by white supremacy and anti-Blackness all the time. Because I feel like sometimes working with white people, they need to be stroked and coddled and reminded how pretty their blonde hair is and how beautiful their blue eyes are by people of color, Black trans people. And it's become a tool of survival here in the Bay Area. And it's an observation that I've made for somebody who has been working in this city for 20 years. And it didn't used to be like that. It used to be you do a good, honest job and support community and meet your contractual goals, and you stand a better chance of getting some of the needs you met. But now it's like whoever kisses the most ass, that's who garners the opportunity. And people, when you call white supremacy out or anti-Blackness, they consider that being rude, mean, and evil and angry. But I have to say that I have to say for me, I will not back down from my unapologetically Blackness. Black trans people will not win with respectability politics.
Thank you for that. Tony, I mean, you've led some organizations and you've interacted, you've come up and done coalition work. You've also you've been in the trenches with some battles with some larger organizations that were white-led, you know, gay-led organizations. And I'm just wondering how do you respond to what Jeanette is talking about here?
Well, I would say during my 5 years in San Francisco and 2 years at St. James, I faced more anti-Blackness and racism than I would have ever anticipated. For a city, which is a lot more liberal than Los Angeles, where I am now, who preaches equality and equity for trans folk, equality, and we want to work with you. It was very difficult. I had some of the gay Caucasians dismiss me. I can't work with her, and we had never even met. There were negative things said, but my policy is the only way to get full trans equality, and that's why I'm in the law, is to get laws, to get decrim for sex work. They're working on that in San Francisco. We're working on that here in LA. Laws are the only thing to give us a footing of equality. And that is laws that we need our city councils and our mayors and governors to pass. There's a lot of anti-Blackness and what's the word? Kind of anti-trans stuff going on in the cities across America. And you would think, most people think San Francisco is a very liberal, very open. It is a city that is given money, but as far as getting true respect, it's been difficult. And I worked around it the best that I could, and I faced a lot of it. And a lot of it came from my white brothers and sisters, and even some of my Black gay brothers and sisters who were supposed to be really on my side. I fought more battles with them than I really did with the straight community. And that's just the fact of it. And that's a shame to say that the LGBTQIA, which we are a member of, I face more discrimination within that group than any other group over the last couple of years as a director, development director, and working specifically for white gay men, for mainly white gay boards, ask things of me that I didn't agree with. This is what we want you to do, and you're going to do it. It was a difficult battle, and that's my thoughts on that. But I think the law and laws are the way to fight inequality. Reversing the healthcare that Trump, reversing transgenders in the military, providing healthcare to transgenders who are marginalized. That's where we win the ground. We have to change the laws with the city councils, the mayors, and the governors. And that's where my focus is right now. Changing laws to make it illegal for you to discriminate against a transgender regarding healthcare, regarding housing. This is illegal. And then there's remedies for that. That's my thinking now.
Yeah, I think that was basically the strategy of the civil rights movement is, pass the laws first and then deal with what people believe, deal with their morality issues later. First let's hold people accountable with the law. And Ava, I'm wondering if you can bring us back a little bit to talk about the special challenges that transgender people faced in the context of the AIDS epidemic in the beginning. And, and from there, maybe we can bring it up to date and talk about COVID, but anyone can address this, but with AIDS in particular, and this connects to what Janetta and Tony were saying, I feel like what we're talking about is a world of, or a mindset of scarcity, where there's not enough for everyone. We have this exhibit that we just launched yesterday, I think it was, on our website, looking at the first 10 years of Pride in San Francisco. And there's a whole section about infighting, within the gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender community, about infighting, just about organizing the annual Pride thing. And this is in the 1970s, when we didn't have, it was still illegal to be gay. And now fast forward to, AIDS and COVID, and with a mindset of scarcity, there's a lot of infighting that happens. So how do you see that playing out during the height of the AIDS epidemic?
I guess I would start first by saying that what Tony and Janetta are saying here is really important to listen to. I think that what we see happen so often in trans community, but also trans activism, is some of the ways in which transphobia is experientially felt. The suffering associated with transphobia can make white and non-Black trans people unaware of how anti-Black racism is structuring their investments, their political alliances. I also think, I lived in San Francisco for a period of time in the Tenderloin across from Divas, and gentrification is really something that has to be looked at, the ways in which gentrification makes vulnerable, particularly communities of color, Black communities, poor communities, and that there are ways in which the transformation of San Francisco has deeply impacted trans populations. So I want to say that in terms of the historical relationship with HIV/AIDS, one of the things that Che and I found in doing our research is that there was really no effort to think about trans women's sexuality, trans women's lives, that there were no ways in which trans women were being specifically attended to or thought about in the early advocacy around HIV/AIDS. And so that carried up into, development of public health policies and so forth. And it's taken a lot of work to intervene and challenge some of that misconception about how to think about trans women's health, how to think about trans women's sexuality. And I think that continues to be a challenge.
Great, yeah, thank you for that.
Hi.
Janetta.
Hi. I'm trying to figure out how Black trans women got locked out of our homes SF. But there was a mandate left that that house was only for Latino trans women. Do not let any Black trans women in that house. That's what I'm trying to figure out here in the city and county to have a better understanding of. And I'm talking about specifically during the process of advocacy for our homes SF. Black trans women were on the flyers. Black trans women were on the front page. Black trans women were at the meetings with the Board of Supervisors, speaking to the Board of Supervisors and doing all the things. And how did they get locked out of our homes SF and out of all the subsidies and all the housing opportunity? Black trans women were the last on the totem pole and they got the scraps. That's what I'm trying to find. And none of the Black trans women that are on the photos are even housed. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
So you were one of the founders of the Transgender Cultural District. And I think, one of the purposes of cultural districts is to, to preserve a community centered around a neighborhood and try to give that community a voice. In your role with your organization or through the Transgender Cultural District, what are the challenges of getting a seat at the table so that the needs of, in particular, Black trans women are heard in formulating public policy? What are the obstacles? What are the challenges?
Well, Black trans women are always called to show up when there's different demonstrations and different opportunities and different things. And I know that TDIJP has a legacy of encouraging Black trans women to go and participate and be a part of and show up when they need to. And there's been various topics that I know that TDIJP has really, really strongly encouraged trans people to show up and share with them, this is very important to you, very important to your life, and specifically people that were currently homeless, and just organize those folks and having them go and participate and show up and work with the Board of Supervisors, volunteer in their spaces and make sure that they're visible. And, if you have an opportunity to let them know what your life experience is about being homeless and having a very difficult time to find housing, and that is with our Homes FF and the Transgender Cultural District. And I know that a lot of Black trans women really showed up in ways that they show up in things in a different way that I, as an executive director and a leader in this community, and some people that encourage people to have a seat at the table with the hopes that they won't be on the menu. But it seems like more and more Black trans people are showing up at the table and they end up finding themselves on the menu. And I'm still trying to figure out how does that go down written in history of the history book as we talk about, and I'm talking about trans history. How is that written in the history books of how did Black trans women get locked out of that housing and the extent that they were? With the mandate that was mandated that that housing was strictly for one particular race of people and exclude Black trans people.
Mm. I'm looking for any insights about this in particular. I mean, I think that that's a very...
How does that resonate in history? How do we
Yeah.
put that in the history book? Like you're a historical society, and those things are interesting on how we overcame and triumphed and so forth and so on. I can share with you how, based on that experience, how TGIJP has overcome that and triumphed over that, despite all the barriers that we've experienced as a Black translated woman, specifically by a Black trans woman who was part of the movement for Black Lives, sits at the reparation table, founder of Compton's Transgender Cultural District, lead founder of Taja's Coalition. I can tell you how we triumphed over that despite those barriers that we experienced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, that's kind of part of the reason why we're doing the panel tonight, is to sort of collect these stories, and it's recorded, and hopefully we'll have some historians and grad students who are gonna like pay attention to this and say, that's something that interests me and I wanna go and research that and write about that. And that's, you know, I mean, they say that history is written by the victors of the war. And I guess we're trying to sort of undercut that somewhat by giving voice to you here. So, and I think the Our Homes SF program is, I mean, I would characterize that as an example of how, you know, policies and funding filters down and ends up being unequitable, you know, and shutting certain people out that were supposed to be targeted. Tony might have some insights into that. I don't know if she wants to talk about it right now.
Well, the whole TransHome SF was led by people who were in the room when it was being discovered, was led by white transgender folk. They were the first ones to originate it and make the deals, and the rules were set by that. So the Black trans folk came in after TransHome had been materialized, had been already spoken to by the Board of Supervisors on what would be done, how it would be done, and so forth and so on. So we were not the originators, we were just ball players in that field. And we were not the leader of TransHome SF. We didn't originate it. It was originated by others who thought of it. And most of the TransHome was written and explained to the Board of Supervisors by our white trans brothers and sisters. And for that, we're thankful for some TransHome SF, but it was never on a equal playing ground. There were rules and policies set. And even before TransHome, Black trans folk who were told in San Francisco they could get housing. Once we got to the bottom of that, there was housing not available. They were getting closed out in the initial interview. We were asking, why have these people been denied housing who were qualified and homeless? There was a point system, and it was explained there was not enough points and this and that. So that is supposed to be changing. But all of this is being led by white folk, white trans, and our white brothers and sisters. So until we are at the table of origination and at birth, you can't have that much input when you're not the founder of an ideal. The people who found it, take it and run with it. So we have to find our own stuff, present it, and make sure that we're the originator of it in order to get equality at the table.
Well, that's really a brutal truth that you're laying out there, I would say, especially when you look at it in the context of AIDS or COVID or both, or, you know, alcohol and substance use also, which, you know, are prevalent within the gay community disproportionately, and is in the transgender community as well. And you can't deal with those issues unless you have some stability, some housing is sort of essential before you can even begin to talk about protecting yourself from these viruses, for example. So, and that, I guess, Aidan, I want to bring you into this a little bit. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Transgender Cultural District's COVID Fund and how that was conceived and how it was being used to provide some emergency support for people? I mean, obviously that wasn't going to create housing for somebody, but it helped to meet some people's emergency needs, correct?
What was the last thing you had said?
Just about the COVID emergency fund that you were helping to administer. How was that helping? How was that designed to help deal with people's emergency needs?
It was designed, well, it was to help people get like groceries or their medication, or like their home, to help pay for like their hormones and stuff. Really, the money could be spent on anything that they need throughout the pandemic. So yeah, the money is put up to help support them and their needs in specific. Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds a lot like the AIDS Emergency Fund, which was created for providing emergency loans or grants to people to pay like their utility bills or whatever. What was your perception around the need versus the availability of funds?
So a lot of people did need it, but we only had, we only have so many funds. So eventually we did have to stop, which really sucks because we would like to continue to be able to support people in this way. Yeah, if that helps.
Yeah, thank you. So with the HIV and AIDS epidemic or the COVID epidemic, talk to me a little bit about housing in particular and about poverty. How do these come into play in terms of allowing people to protect themselves from infection?
This is Tony. Well, in Los Angeles, if you're homeless and most transgenders make under $24,000 a year, we're 6 times more likely to be under the poverty level. So if you make no money and you have no housing, and you're in the middle of a pandemic when there is a lockdown and you have nowhere to go, and now HUD is telling you you can't go to the homeless shelters because of you being a transgender, they want to put you somewhere else. It's just impossible to survive. And if you have HIV on top of that, which several of them here in LA did, they found themselves in the hospital in severe shape because they had no home and no money and no health care, which is just like a trio of bad combination. You have no health care, you have no money and no home. Where do you go to in a pandemic when HUD is telling you you're not welcome in the homeless shelters here in LA County? Where exactly do you go? I mean, survival at that level is just crucial. And you have other barriers of health involved, such as HIV on top of that. I found 3 of them here in the hospital being discriminated against, and we had to take legal action for them to get help. I mean, we had to go in with a lawyer to say, you will treat this person, because they left them in the hallway and no one would touch the 3 transgenders who were HIV positive and had tested positive for COVID-19 with no address, no money, and no healthcare card to help them. So once again, my thing is legal action, laws are the only way that you fight for equality. And that's what we did here. We had to go and get attorneys to say these people will get treated, whether they're homeless, they don't have jobs, they don't have health care. Other people go with no health care and they got treated. And it's supposed to be covered, I thought, by the government. If you tested positive for COVID virus, don't worry about it. You don't need health care. That didn't apply to these trans women of color here in Los Angeles. And that was very sad. So that's the barrier you're facing here in LA County. You have no home, you have no money, you have no health care. You know, what the hell are you supposed to do? And then you go to the hospital and they won't treat you. They're afraid to touch you over everybody else in the ward. And what is that about? As if you are more contagious than the person to your left or your right. So that was the difficulty that we had during COVID-19 starting in March here in LA County with trans women of color. Couldn't get any help and was practically denied admittance to the hospital once they were identified as trans women of color. Were pretty much told, go back to the street and figure it out. And that was sad. That was very sad.
That's exactly what you did. Did she resign or was she fired?
Janetta, did you have anything to chime in here?
You know what? I'm gonna shut my mouth. I'm gonna shut my mouth.
I wonder if anybody can talk to me a little bit about the challenges of being transgender and accessing healthcare specifically. I mean, Tony, you talked about it with respect to HIV and COVID a little bit, but also in terms of gender transitioning. What were the challenges around HIV and AIDS around that, and what are the challenges right now with COVID?
Well, I transitioned 25 years ago, so I was in New York, where HIV was very prevalent. So I don't know about transitioning now. My transition was 20 plus years ago, and most of the young ladies that we were seeing pretty much people on the street who call themselves doctors for our hormones. We had no health care. There was no Obamacare. So we were getting pretty much all we needed out of a van by someone who we call Dr. So-and-so. Is how we did it back 25 years ago. That's not the case now. With Obamacare, Medicaid, Medi-Cal, it's a bit easier, but I can't answer that because I'm not transitioned in this decade. So I can't answer that. How it is to transition now during COVID virus, I can't speak on that.
Ava, do you have any?
No, I mean, I transitioned now 20 years ago. And so for me, being HIV positive, of course, in the context of COVID, you know, there were so little resources on how to be HIV positive and navigate the coronavirus, that there was no information really. I have a healthcare from a local community health provider, and you know, everyone was trying to figure out how to advise HIV positive people on how to navigate COVID, but that remains still somewhat unclear to me in this moment.
We have heard reports, of course, of people being transgender during this pandemic in particular, and being shut in and not. Transgender surgery may be considered elective surgery, certainly in some contexts, and elective surgeries had been postponed. I think that's probably changing right now. Have you heard anything about that?
I have not.
Yeah, and so also, you know, while we're talking about COVID and the shutdown, we've seen a lot of reports around particularly young people that are forced to shelter in either their family of origin's home or with roommates or whatever living situation where they're with a in a hostile environment that is not supportive of their gender identity. On top of that, we get reports around domestic violence increasing across the board, with people being forced to shelter in place and no way to get out of the house and stay safe. Aiden, have you heard anything about that in particular with young people?
In my experience, when I was homeless in the beginning of the pandemic, my own like obstacles and the obstacles of the other people who were trans that were also living in the youth shelter at the time, sorry about that, was just like the transphobia within the shelters, and also like the cramped living situation. We were all more exposed. People were getting sick, but there was like nowhere we could really go other than like the streets. So we just have to stay and like deal with it. So yeah, that was a real big struggle for the trans youth within the Tenderloin.
I mean, I think so much of these issues are predicated on people having access. And I think what both HIV revealed to us as well as COVID is that structural forms of racism make unavailable home, so that the possibility of access to healthcare is already sort of a problematic place to start, given the structural issues that are both define HIV and define COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So any of you, I'm curious. We've talked a lot about the structural racism that I think the country is focusing on right now, in particular in the wake of the George Floyd murder and other examples of police brutality. But it's nothing new. It's nothing new, and it certainly was going on during the AIDS epidemic. And I'm wondering if any of you can speak to how, in particular, Black trans people, got their concerns heard as part of the development of AIDS programs in the United States. Did you have experiences around that? How do we make our voices heard?
Okay. Can we just name Tony McDade, the Black trans man from Tallahassee, was murdered by the police? Can everybody say his name? Tony McDade.
Tony McDade, yes.
Okay.
Nina Pop.
Yes. And this is on top of like an epidemic of murders of trans women of color, going on across the United States. And so this is this heightened focus on police brutality and these particular murders is actually nothing new. And I think there's been a struggle to get awareness and attention to these issues for some time. And I'm wondering, do you see this as a hopeful moment where we can begin to draw more attention to this community's concerns around that?
I think so. In LA, there have been several protests in Hollywood and West Hollywood for Black Trans Lives Matter. LA Pride turned it into a march this past Sunday for Black trans lives, singing all the names of all the many transgender women of color who've been killed. So LA Pride allowed all Black Lives Matter to take it over, and it really featured and centered on over about 20,000 people yelling Black Trans Lives Matter and naming the names of all the trans people of color who were killed. I think protest, trans folk running for office, and making our voices heard is a way to get the word out, get the recognition that trans folk need in order to proceed forward. That was very enlightening on Sunday here in Hollywood, where they came out in droves. So it was amazing. I think we need more of that, the protesting, the city halls, telling the mayors and the governors, especially in Mississippi, there's only one trans-led group down there. They're suffering, and they're getting ready to go march on City Hall. to say we deserve our rights and equality as well. So
I wish I would have never agreed to this.
Janetta, were you saying something for us?
I said I love the Lord, and He heard my cry.
Okay.
I think that the protest and demonstration that happened in Brooklyn was incredible for Black trans life. I thought that was a really remarkable event. And so I don't know if I'm hopeful, but I am amazed to see such force and presence and voice.
Aiden, have you had the opportunity to participate in any of the protest marches or anything like that?
Yes, I had to join the one on two that were in SF. I forget when the.
I'm sorry, we froze on you. We may have a bad connection with Aiden. I
wanted to say that all that is really wonderful. I mean, they can show up, they can paint the signs, paint the street. I'm actually going to do a little bit of painting of the street. But also, I'm going to, my thing is Black trans people need capital, and they need an opportunity to create the sustainability that Black trans people need. Black trans-led organizations that are authentically Black trans-led organizations that are there to serve the Black trans community and not lock Black trans community out of situations like our homes SF. We need our ownership of our own spaces, because we need to know that we have a safe space that we can come and grow and build without white supremacy, patriarchy, anti-Blackness, and we need to have a safe space so we can enter and exit without harassment and trauma. Black trans women will always welcome everybody else in, but everybody else will not welcome us in without the judgment of our Blackness. It is clear, I will constantly remind y'all that Black trans women were locked out of housing here in the city and county of San Francisco. I will run that till I'm like Maxine Waters. I'm gonna keep saying it until people get sick of hearing me, and I'm gonna keep saying it. Black trans women were locked out of housing here in our homes SF. And we need capital so that we can have ownership of our own building, so that we can respond in the way that we need to respond when there's violence that's happening towards trans people. We need to be able to go there and support them and bring them in and make sure that they have the support they need. And it's not happening in the way that it needs to happen. So we need capital, we need sustainability. There's not a lot of Black trans people that own their own homes, you know, and it's like, that's the only way we will make it as a community.
Thank you. And so, and I think that that's a really important point, economic empowerment. So what can be done, or what is being done, or what has been done around economic empowerment for Black trans folks in particular? And I'm thinking about the employment. You know, what employment opportunities are there to develop that capital that we're talking about, or that economic power?
You know, I have to tell you that TJJP has been working really hard, because we do have a reentry socioeconomic justice program where we do hire trans people coming directly out of jails and prison, and we pay them X amount of money, X amount of hours to work. And part of that is for their workforce and professional development, and the other part is for their opportunity to develop themselves professionally, entering a society that has never really been socially acceptable for trans people. And so we create job opportunities for people coming directly out of prison. However, because I mean, I mean, this was a vision that I had when I was sitting in jail, and I was like seeing trans people coming in and out, and I was like, I'm going to create opportunities so when trans people get out of jail, they don't have to, you know, like making a decision that I knew I fucked up, I was in a compromising place, and how do I prevent this not just for myself, but for other trans people, and designing this program to support people. And that's the part that comes in when I say that we have been trying to open up a restaurant, an event space, trying to create opportunities so that when the big conferences come to San Francisco Bay Area, instead of giving the Plum Bar $20,000 to host the event, give us the $20,000 and we host the event. And we create. I don't feel comfortable that Black trans people have to rely on certain funding. I think that we have, if given the opportunity to be supported and given the support that we need and the space and opportunity, we can generate our own income outside of the world of HIV and AIDS, and outside of the world. Like it just always having a safe landing for trans people to come. I mean, you think about people flock to San Francisco Bay Area every day. Here, I've met so many people right on the corner of Market and 7th, like just got dropped off right there. I just got off the Greyhound bus and they have nothing. They have no opportunity. And it would be nice if we could provide them with the interim, opportunity to garner income as they transition into the next phase. It would be nice if we had a space that we can hold people until they find other opportunities. But I don't feel like that the community is being supported and invested in the way that it needs to be. And it's kind of like, will always leave us in a bad place where we're always struggling, where we have to kiss somebody's behind in order to like get our needs met. And what happens if you just don't want to kiss nobody's behind? You know what I'm saying? You have to do double, sometimes triple the work in order to stand what you believe in. And that's been my experience here in San Francisco, being shot at systems for being who I am.
And Tony, your organization, I think, also worked with trans sex workers, or you've worked with them in San Francisco, and I'm sure Janetta as well, and Aiden. But I'm thinking about like what the challenges were for trans sex workers in particular in accessing HIV prevention programs and services, and then what are the special challenges right now? Because, and it's not necessarily specific to just trans sex workers, but sex workers more broadly, and yet the challenges are compounded, I think, in terms of housing and employment and everything else, and which exacerbates the situation for sex workers. And so can any of you speak to that in particular?
Well, there's a study coming out of DC about sex work. Most of the sex workers are not finding any employment now. When COVID went on, it declined a great deal, and we found a lot of the trans ladies here working back at Western and Santa Monica, back on the streets, currently through COVID-19. And they lost their housing, which was limited housing. They didn't have a job, and they were HIV positive. Sex workers in general have stated 62% could not do any work. This is females, males, and trans people in that as well. It killed sex work. And until we decriminalize sex work, which I think San Francisco would be the first city to do so, to make it stop arresting them, that's one of the many problems that you face. But COVID knocked that right out with the quarantine. Everything was closed, and most of these people found no employment. So COVID killed that business tremendously. And the study said 72% of sex workers found themselves without any money, any food, and you can't get the money that the government is giving out for the stimulus because you didn't file a 2017, 2018 tax form. So if you've been working as a sex worker, whether you're gay, lesbian, bi, or trans, you haven't paid any taxes. You don't have a tax form. You don't get any of the $600 a week, which ends in July. You don't get any money for unemployment. So it's just, it makes it difficult. They do it to survive. I did it to survive, but I didn't file taxes when I did it years ago. So if you're working as a sex worker in 2020, you didn't file taxes in 2019 or 2018, you're not on any IRS roll, you get no stimulus, which ends July 31st, if they're gonna renew it. You don't get anything because you don't get disability or anything because you're not on the rolls of anybody, especially the government. The government only gave that to people. If you haven't filed 2019, they went by your 2018 and 2017 tax form. We had a little seminar trying to help 40 trans women get the stimulus, and 39 of them were declined because they hadn't filed a tax form in the last several years because they've been doing sex work, looking for employment. They couldn't get employment. So it's just very difficult. You can't find work that pay you a tax where you can get taxed. You're doing sex work, which is cash under the table. It's just very difficult. It's very difficult. So it made them more homeless, no food, and it made it difficult. During COVID, when everything closed down and we were quarantined, and then they tell you to be in by 9 o'clock. Don't be on the streets or they'll pick you up at 9:30 and tell you to go home where you're homeless. You have nowhere to go. It's a compounded problem.
Right. So, we have, I mean, when I go around the streets in San Francisco, I feel like we are in a crisis situation in more than one way, but certainly with the homeless population in San Francisco, and I saw that with the HIV and AIDS epidemic too. And there was special programs that were created, like the HOPWA program that was designed to create housing opportunities for people with AIDS. How are we going to respond to this crisis right now? I mean, and in particular, I mean, it seems as though the trans people of color, women, is really just the tip of the spear, in terms of the challenges that we're facing. And if we can't deal with these compounded problems with some targeted services, what's going to be the outcome here? I mean, people are being exposed to COVID, on the streets today, and they can't wait, for legislation necessarily that's going to take years. So, is there a way forward, and are there any lessons that we learned in responding to HIV and AIDS that could be applied to this? I mean, that's a big question.
It is a big question.
But things are moving very fast, and people that are homeless or out of work and out of money and exposed to COVID, they can't wait. Finding platforms to speak out and to unify around that. And I think you all have talked about creating programs that are of, by, and for Black trans women. Is that happening now? Is that being organized, or are we just calling for it and hoping that the mayor comes around and creates the program for them?
Well, some people are and some people aren't, and some people say they are. So it's a mixed bag of what's going out as it pertains to Black trans community. Once again, I will reiterate, they will put Black trans women on the face, but they have it. I mean, it's just like, just imagine you being on the face of Coca-Cola and you're sleeping on the street in a tent. You know what I mean? It's like, that's really, I mean, and I've heard stories of various people that have allowed people to use their image and songs and those people became very famous, but the person that actually presented the image, had the conversation, are still being harmed, and the person that, it's the person that used their image is doing well. Like the people that use Black trans women face are laying in goose down pillows and blankets and so forth and so on, and but trans people are still sleeping on the streets in tent. And I have to really like compliment TGIJP because we know that respectability politics will not protect or save Black trans people. So, we managed to work our ass off, and I feel like we didn't have to work 2 times, 3 times, but we had to work 4 times harder to house Black trans women. And we just housed 20-something people in the last couple days, and these were the people that we had shelter in place during COVID-19. We went out to serve 12 of our members, 6 that were in our office, but others were homeless in the streets. And we ended up with about 28 people. And because of our hard work and because of our perseverance and because we never get up and we never give up, and we were determined to make sure that none of these people that we had in shelter in place will return back to the street, despite certain entities completely locked us out, such as Office of Transgender Initiative and other Our Home SF opportunities. We still managed to house all these people, permanently house them, and work on creating other opportunities to make sure that these people are in a safe place. And it's been a very rewarding experience to hear different people share about their highlights of what does it mean to be Black and trans and housed, and people that are like under the ages of 30. Some of the people were under ages of 35 and a little bit older than 45. And it's just despite all the barriers and the fact that Black trans-led organizations have to work even harder, especially if they're intentional about their Blackness and unapologetically Black. Now, was all the people that we housed Black, African-American descent? No. And we just house trans people that have been chronically homeless.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that work. And I think it's really important to note that although you are an activist, clearly, Janetta, and that you're not playing the game of respectability politics, you're also doing walking the talk. I mean, you're doing the work. And, and every person that gets housing, that's a miracle for them. Every person that gets help and gets moved off the street, that's a miracle for them. And so I really applaud that work. And Aiden and Eva, I'd like to kind of like bring you back into the discussion again. And Aiden, talk to me a little bit. What are you thinking hearing all this? What is your experience on the ground? And you're a young person. You've come to San Francisco. You're talk to me about how you identify and how your experience around accessing services and helping to provide services for the transgender community during the COVID crisis. What in the context of everything that we're hearing here, what are you thinking? I'm going to unmute you.
Sorry, what was the last thing that you had said?
Just what are you thinking?
Well, I guess for my identity, I am no longer homeless, so I guess I wouldn't identify as a homeless young person. And as for the resources, I have been able to, as for resources, there is a couple for food and stuff, but in order to get the food, you have to go through like a crowd of people which has been really difficult, and I feel like puts a lot of people who, like homeless people or other people who need to go and get that food at risk. Yeah, so that's been like kind of like my experience with that within this area. And everything is very like, everyone is very like cramped living situation. Yeah. So I guess within the Tenderloin, I feel like there's more of a chance for like everyone to be exposed to COVID-19.
Yeah, so how are you contending with that?
Uh,
How are you contending with that personally? I mean, are you protecting yourself? Are you,
I try to stay home as much as I can. It has been difficult to try and get food due to like everyone is like, when I say like people are like very, very close, like I mean people are very, very close. So I get very nervous going outside because I'm always having to try and like navigate through it all. Yeah, it has been a struggle.
yeah. And, you know, I mean, we've seen COVID disproportionately affecting people that are not able to shelter in place, obviously, but also essential workers who need to go out to work, and so we have COVID, like with HIV, disproportionately affecting people of color, and also people like yourself who need to go out just to get food. You know, I mean, just to get food and to access it in a communal environment can be super challenging. Eva, what are you thinking about?
About what? Sorry.
Yeah, what are you thinking about the current conversation that we're having in relationship to COVID and the transgender community in particular, and the challenges that we're experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I was saying earlier is that COVID exposes what the ongoing pandemic of AIDS. I mean, AIDS is not a historical event. It's an ongoing pandemic that many of us continue to be living with and through. And like AIDS, COVID simply exposed the structural inequalities, and it laid bare the ways in which those are racially structured, economically structured. And I think that continues to be what's difficult to confront, how to think about those structural inequalities remains an ongoing problem.
Yeah, you know, I was just looking at a report, a draft report today that I was participating in, which was looking at preserving the LGBTQ culture of San Francisco and how the city government and nonprofit agencies can help to, you know, facilitate and sustain LGBTQ culture in all of its diversity. And I'm like, in the context of the heightened awareness around racial inequality and white supremacy, and police brutality, I'm like going, we need to start over. You know, we need to like scrap this long report of recommendations and say, let's start over, and let's bring Janetta to the table, and so many others, and say, you know, let's look at this through the lens of trans people of color in particular, you know, and I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to say, you know what, you know, the plan was to take this report to the Board of Supervisors and then pass it along to the mayor, and it's been in the works for like 2 years, and it's some lovely stuff, but it's mostly created by, you know, white gay people, and you know, with some representation from other groups, but it's sort of like our best ideas. It just doesn't make any sense anymore, and I don't want to like take it to the mayor and say this is what we want, even if it says create housing opportunities for trans people of color. You know, they weren't part of the process in creating it. So, so I think I am hopeful that, you know, and through my own process and through conversations with her, I'm hopeful that there is an opportunity right now to like reopen the conversations on the structures that we have, and say, how can we do this differently? And part of the opportunity is created by the murders of Tony McDade and George Floyd and others, and Black trans people over the years, and part of it by COVID and part of it by Trump. And so now we've got this movement on our hands. And so what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with it? How are we going to take advantage of these opportunities? And, you know, with that, I just want to say we have like 10 minutes. And if anybody wants to pop any questions into the question box, but if not, I'm going to go around and say, you know, if you, I mean, looking back on the last, you know, 40 years of almost of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and the last 4 months of the COVID pandemic, the structural racism that goes back 400 years in this country, you know, what would you want? What do you see as the opportunities and challenges going forward for trans people in particular? What do you want to see? What do you want to see? And if you had like 2 minutes to say, what would be your dream? What would be your dream for the next year in the midst of this movement and this crisis? What would you say?
I would really say that in order to do this work and in order to support this movement, we need the support of just a little bit more capital in order to like really put ourselves in a position so that we could have the sustainability and a lot less stress, particularly around doing the work, because I feel like systemically they keep us in confusion and we always responding as an act of urgency. We're always feeling this sense of vulnerable and we're not gonna make it. And it's just like, you know, you have to fight through that every day and you have to push through that every day in order to continue to support community members and create jobs for Black trans people. That's been the work that TGIJP has been doing for years. That has been the work that I have been doing for years. Miss Major is my transgender mother, and Miss Major always told me, once you get a job and you get yourself settled in that job, you bring in another trans person. You bring in another Black trans woman. Always, once you get housing, you get into that housing, you get some rest, and you bring in another trans person. Help another girl. You ain't got to bring them to your house. Help another trans girl get a house. And just make sure you know that one of the reasons why you're supporting her to continue to, for us to continue to help each other and support each other in getting into opportunity, because of the challenges that we face a lot of times. And in order to get housing, it's like a lot of us have to go through the back door. We can't just walk up to the front door and be like, ringing the bell, I need housing, I'm interested. Somehow, we always have to go through the back door in order to get housing. It doesn't matter what class or background you come from or you think you come from within the Black trans community. If you get clocked in a lot of situations and you get spooked, you don't get that opportunity unless the very limited housing that is allotted specifically for trans people, you know, and yeah, so.
Thank you, Janetta. Yeah, and I think because there is a movement here, and by movement, I mean lots of people paying attention, and there's some momentum behind it. I think there is an opportunity to raise the bar, to increase the ask. ask for more than what you might have asked for yesterday. And so I'm just thinking about your call for capital. You know, let's think about, you know, how much we want, what's, you know, and where it can actually come from, because there are possibilities there. And I echo what you're saying, and I just want to like help if I can to, you know, try to put a point on that. But
yeah, and I just wanted to be clear about one thing, especially right now during this pandemic. I don't think any non-Black led organization should be asking a Black trans person or a Black led organization to do a fundraiser and they split the money. If you're not a Black trans led organization that intentionally serves Black trans, GNC, non-binary communities, and you know your scope of people and you know who you serve, I don't think you should be asking Black trans people, Black trans-led organizations to do a fundraiser and split the money with you. I think you should be just raising money for Black trans-led organization and give them the money.
thank you, Janetta, for keeping it real. I appreciate that very much. Anyone else want to take the baton here? Tony, we're going to unmute you. Tony, we need to unmute you. There we go.
As long as you get city, state, and federal funding, you're limited. Google, all these corporations who are giving millions now to Black-led organizations, if they would reach out to Black-led trans organizations, that's where you have the freedom and the capital to do what you want. As long as you're getting city, state, and federal money, that money is limited, that money is geared, and there are instructions and rules that go with that money. I think now that corporations are stepping up, I think 42 million has been raised for Black Lives Matter. If some of that money could go to transgender groups and Black transgender groups from these corporations who give that money without telling you how to spend it, and give me your midterm reports, and these are the things you need to be spending that money on. When you get city, state, and federal funding, it's limited, it's directed, there's reports that go with it, and you're not able to do what you really want to do with that money. That money, if we could get money from corporations and foundations outside of that realm of city government, which is great, state money is great, and so is federal money, but it's limited in how you can spend it. It must be spent on a particular program that you've applied for. I think the foundations, corporations who are giving millions of dollars to support Black Lives Matter, if they could reach out to Black trans organizations and transgender groups, I think that would be amazing, to give millions to those groups to free up so they can do what they want to do with it and not worry about, I have to do a report every month to get this city money. It's very limited. It's very limiting.
Yes. And Janetta, maybe we could get the web address for making donations to your organization for anyone that's either watching live or listening to the recording. I'm gonna, we need to unmute you. Janetta, can you unmute?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just want to get your, where do people donate to your organization?
Oh, they can go to our website at tgijp.org.
Okay, great. Thank you.
tgijp.org.
Yeah, and if you know, Sergi Brin or any Google or Facebook executive is watching, you know, just put a lot of zeros on there. Okay, thank you. Ava or Aiden, your dream. Go ahead.
Can I get a little recap on it?
Eva, can I go to you first and we'll go to Aiden last?
Sure.
Yeah. You may be repeating yourself because you said some great stuff already, I think, but you know, if you could have whatever you could get, you know, out of this crisis that we're experiencing right now, this multifactorial crisis, what would be your dream in just a minute or two?
I mean, I think that so many amazing points have been already said that I would simply echo. I think investing in Black trans organizations is crucial, critical. I think that is the beginning of addressing many of the injustices that I think initially were going to focus on around HIV, but also COVID. I think focusing resources there is essential for intervening in these structural violences. And so that is my wish.
Great, thank you. Aiden, any thoughts? You're the youngest in the crowd. Maybe you can give us a perspective for us on what would be your dream to help to deal with the trans community's needs during the AIDS and COVID crises.
I guess my dream would be more available resources and like less discrimination towards people who are trans and people who are trans people of color. Yeah, because it makes it harder to get the resources at the places that are giving them when they're being so transphobic.
Thank you. That brings us back to the beginning of this, which was really about transphobia and discrimination, which underlies all of these issues that we're addressing here tonight. So I just want to thank everyone for your contributions, and I applaud and really appreciate all the work that you've done and that you continue to do. And I know it's often a thankless struggle. And I hope that tonight will help sort of enlighten people a little bit about the challenges that our community faces. And I also just want to make a quick pitch. GLBThistoricalsociety.org. We're doing a membership special this month for Pride, $35 for a year, and you get a lot of cool benefits like discounts on hoodies and stuff like that. So I just want to throw that out there. And with that, say thank you again to all of you for your time and for your generosity of thought and spirit. And with that, I'll say, go wash your hands.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Janetta, Aiden, Tony, Ava.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night. Thanks everyone for participating.
Take care.